Good morning. Welcome to Tribal Jazzman Scholar. I want to talk about a field called evolutionary psychology. And the field is a very exciting field. They're of the mind, evolutionary psychologists, that they're going to create a metatheory into which all the other social sciences can fit, much the way that the physical sciences have sort of the laws of physics and biology into which everything else must fit in order to make sense. But the social sciences, whether you're a sociologist or a psychologist or an anthropologist, you'll have a completely different set of rules and vocabulary that govern the way you structure your discourse. And in many ways, these disciplines don't cross-pollinate and they don't communicate. But evolutionary psychology takes the premise that if we study the brain in terms of how it evolved and what it evolved to respond to, in other words, if we examine what they like to call, kind of a long word, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, the EEA. And that's basically what they call the Pleistocene. It's the era into which most of humanity's history falls. Homo sapiens have been on the planet in the modern form, the one that we are in now, physiologically modern humans, have been on the planet for 200,000 years. And then very similar-looking hominids that looked very different from the other primates, the ones who made fire and stone tools, and they've been around for 3 million years at least. So that period of 3 million years all the way up until the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago, which in terms of historic time, that agricultural piece is very, very small. And in fact, one of the things the evolutionary psychologists remind us is that 10,000 years of agriculture, civilization as we know it, in spite of all its changes, it's been non-nomadic, non-hunting-gathering, and non-tribal. That 10,000 years approximately of agriculture, domesticated animals in cities, towns, trade, and economies and things, it isn't a long enough period of time for there to have been evolutionary changes in our bodies of any significant kind. Whereas if we look at the long history in which we lived as hunters and gatherers, we can begin to understand much of our evolved physiology and our evolved psychology. So the evolutionary psychologists are of the mind that we possess a great number of what they call psychological mechanisms. And these are what ultimately, in a way, they restrict human behavior in the sense that we have this collection of human universals. And I guess that's sort of the more exciting way to look at it. But before I say that, culture, which is sort of the external expression of psychological mechanisms, is so varied that for a long, long time, there was a common belief that, well, we are the product of culture. We come out a blank slate. In fact, that's an expression that's been used. Humans are born a blank slate, and then they're fed everything that they come to know and learn through through the nurture of the environment. And the criticisms of the part of that nature-nurture debate, the criticisms of the nature idea that we are the products of an evolutionary process, that we have psychological mechanisms that might imply predispositions, that has been used to justify all sort of racism and sexism, and it's been used, and so we have a very strong reaction to the possibility that we have any sort of evolved mechanisms. We like to think that, well, the body's evolved, and clearly there's differences in gender and things, and there's racial differences, but, God forbid that the mind is anything but a blank slate, because that might imply that men and women have different proclivities or different abilities. And what we do find, though, in studies of the brain and the development of the brain in the fetus and during adolescence, is that the male and female brains, while anatomically similar, identical, really, they receive much different treatments of hormones, and that those hormone treatments really do impact the differences that we can find in boys and girls, men and women. But it's very important in this discussion to frame it in ways that don't imply that certain differences are superior. It's a very tenuous ground to walk on. But I wanted to share a little bit about the field of evolutionary psychology because of its capacity to contribute meaningfully to the discussion and understandings in the social sciences in general. One of the things the evolutionary psychologists use as a metaphor, and it's actually something that was done as a sort of a quasi-experimental way of making a strong analogy, is they took a group of electrical engineers at a conference and they showed them a diagram. And the diagram had all sorts of labeled circuits, and it showed the directions of all the wires. and they asked the electrical engineers, the 80 or so participants in the auditorium, to explain what that circuit board would be able to do. And they were not able to do so. Then they were asked, the same group, please design a circuit that would allow a refrigeration unit to shut off at such and such a time, at such and such a temperature and pressure of Freon. And it was giving them the sort of conditions under which you might want to produce a circuit board, and they ended up all producing a very similar looking circuit board to the one that was shown previously. And so the point being made by the evolutionary psychologists in this analogy is that if you know what something was designed to do, you're much better able to understand it and study it. So their thesis is, these evolutionary psychologists, is that if we understand what the mind was evolved to do, what it was asked to respond to over those 3 million years of evolution, what in our social environment might have led us to do many of the things that are universal in human cultures. Across human cultures, universally, there are expressions, ways of interacting that every human does, every human group does. We have, and if you think about them in each one distinctly, you begin to wonder, well, what function does it serve? Well, it must serve some function or we wouldn't do it. Some of them are, we have marriage rituals, transition rituals like rites of passage, we have death rituals, we have coyness displays, we have, we tell proverbs, we tell jokes. So some of these are the linguistic. Then there are some mate preference behaviors that you see. Then there are things like fears of spiders and snakes, which are clearly evolved responses to environmental dangers, while handguns and plug sockets kill a lot more people in the world. If you do a controlled study of people's fear response to images, plug sockets and weapons do not elicit the same response as spiders and snakes, because those are not evolved fears. They don't produce an evolved response because they haven't been around long enough to affect our evolutionary responses. So evolutionary psychology really looks at human universals and then also tries to understand the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, where we spent 99% of our evolutionary history, to begin to appreciate why we might do some of the things we do and the ways that we do them. And it's making significant contributions in my mind to our understanding of ourselves. I would say also, with a caveat, that evolutionary psychologists seem very bound in the scholarly, academic, deterministic way of viewing life, and they would benefit from what I think I would like to call a more holistic, a more perhaps spiritual way of looking at the big picture of human development. I think we all would, but I see evolutionary psychologists as very myopic sometimes at what they study and what they look at, but fascinating sets of contributions that they've made. And in that regard, it's quite, I think it's making quite a contribution to our understanding of ourselves. And with that, Tribal Jazzman Scholar will sign off. Thanks for joining me.